So this evening, I'm very excited to welcome Youssef Rakha to celebrate the release of the Dissenters. Amna, Nimo, Mouna. These are all names for a single Egyptian woman whose life has mirrored that of her country. After her death in 2015, her son, Nour, ascends to the attic of their house where he glimpses her in a series of ever more immersive visions. Amna, as a young woman forced into an arranged marriage in the 1950s, a coquettish student of French known to her confidants as Nimo, a self-made divorcee and a lover, a pious mama donning her hijab, and finally a feminist activist during the Arab Spring. Charged and renewed by these visions of a woman he has always known as Mouna, Nour begins a series of fevered letters to his sister, who's been estranged from Mouna and from Egypt for many years, in an attempt to reconcile what both siblings know about this mercurial woman, their country, and the possibility for true revolution after so much has failed. Youssef Rakha is an Egyptian author of fiction and nonfiction, working in Arabic and English. He's the author of the Book of Sultan Seal, The Crocodiles, and Paulo, which was long listed for the International Prize for Arabic Fiction and won the 2017 Sawiris Award. Rakha will be in conversation with Eman, Quotah, the author of Bride of the Sea, winner of the Arab American Book Award for Fiction. Her next book, a folklore-inspired horror novel, is forthcoming in the US and the UK in the fall of 2025. Please join me in welcoming Youssef Rakha and Eman Quotah.
This is my book, but that's your watercolor. Do you want to read from your book?
Sure. We'll
Okay.
start that way.
All right, yeah. This is Youssef's, this is your first 24 hours in the United States, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so could everybody welcome him? Marhaba!
Thank you. Thank you. No, it's been great, but a little bit disorienting, as you might expect. So this is a tiny bit of the first letter in the book, and this is Nour speaking about his mother, and his brother. Abid is Nour's brother. In all of a month, Abid has come once to the hospital, twice to the house. On his second visit, I catch him having propped Mouna uncomfortably up, trying to steer her through the motions of Salah. Clearly furious, eager to protest more forcefully, she only has strength to groan. Abid has money, I remember, yet he hasn't paid a single guinea towards the greatest expense in Mouna's life. If not for her savings and the check you and your partner sent, I could never have afforded the hospital bill. Abid has carefully conserved his material resources, but now he's saving Mouna's soul. And all over Egypt it is like this, people observing the rituals to improve their solvency with Allah while defaulting on what human loans they can. Coming up from behind, I punch him on the head as hard and as quietly as I can before I ease her back down and rearrange the pillows the way she likes, kissing her cheeks. I hear a car brake violently after she falls unconscious again. At dusk, she stops breathing. I have no idea why I postponed making the phone calls that will fill up the house and set off the mortuary formalities. By midnight, I have slipped under the covers beside her, sniffing the sweat on her neck, playing with her earlobe, feeling her warm flesh go cold while I doze. I think I hear the dawn as in much earlier than it is supposed to sound. The world, spaced out, is speeding down some derelict highway in time, and long before my attic visions start, Shimo, I'm thinking it is time that happens to people. We talk about having and saving and wasting it as if it is ours to work with, but really it is us who are time's property. It molds and meddles with us, changes us without our knowing, so that one day we wake up with no idea who we are, and suddenly the life that we've lived is no longer ours. When I slip in next to her, I will never forget this. Mouna is no longer there. Something else lies in her place. It is familiar and benign, but it isn't Mouna. Of all that happens in the last week of her life, this has to be the hardest moment. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Thanks for reading that. When I read that in the book, that part was one of the parts that really struck me, because I grew up in Saudi Arabia in the 80s and early 90s, and that sense of religion being this thing that people pay into, and then there are all these, like, I don't know, cheating was rampant in my high school, and everybody let that happen. So that sort of hypocrisy. I wanted to start by asking you to talk with me a little bit about the special place that Egypt has in the Arab imagination, the modern Arab imagination. I think maybe we have a mixed audience, so maybe some people are familiar with that and others aren't. But Egypt being the place where there's so much pop culture, music, movies, over the past century. My own personal obsession with Egypt started when I was a teenager, and we had in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia at the time, there was no satellites, there was no streaming, but sometimes when the weather was just right, we could get Egyptian television. And so we could watch old Egyptian movies, Egyptian tamsiliyas. But on top of that, also, my uncle had an old stamp collection that he gave to my brother, and he had some stamps from the United Arab Republic. And so that started my interest in Nasserism. And anyways, so can you talk about that a little bit? Like how Egypt is sort of almost the center of the world in a way.
Yeah, where would I start? I mean, it gets very complicated. Okay, so I'll just say this: a Palestinian friend of mine used to say that whenever he came to Egypt, because the dialects are different, you see, that like people speak differently in different Arab countries, and he used to say that whenever he came to Egypt, he felt like he was inside a television show, because that's how everybody spoke, you know. And so for the longest time, I mean, this has been challenged now mainly by, I suppose, by Syrian television in the last, I don't know, 30 years or so. But for the longest time, television in Arabic and most cinema and music was Egyptian. And this kind of coincided with the post-colonial nationalist movement under Nasser. It didn't originate under Nasser. It originated in the 40s, because Egypt was a crossroads, and it was relatively prosperous at the time. I guess 20s, 30s, and a lot of the Levant, a lot of like Greater Syria had been ruled from Egypt historically in modern times. So I guess a lot of people emigrated, a lot of artists and singers and things like that, and the infrastructure existed for people to really shine. You know, so we talk about the golden age of really all kinds of things, like Oriental dance, like belly dancing, but also Quranic recitation, like melodic recitation of the Quran, which is a beautiful, beautiful art, and is all but extinct now. And this really totally originated in Egypt. So you would get, like, I recently saw a video on YouTube of Khamenei kind of going crazy, passionately praising the recitation of Mustafa Ismail, who's my favorite reciter.
Okay.
And that was amazing to see that. So yeah, and obviously having that sort of status, Egypt becomes, I mean, I guess it's kind of like America in the English speaking or the Western world. It becomes this almost magical, almost like mythical place where amazing things happen. So Eman tells me her new book is about Ahmad Sharif, for example, who's like It's like a huge icon, and he's quite well known in English as well
Right.
because he acted in Hollywood. But that's not uncommon, except of course sometimes you get the opposite response from Arabs who are not Egyptians as well. They kind of resent that, and they feel it's overrated or unfair or whatever, which is, which can be equally true. Except that the sad part, of course, is this is all in the past now. I mean, it has been in the past for a little while, but still, but it's still fresh in the imagination. So I don't know. Does that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I think that brings a little bit to sort of the way that so many eyes turned to the Arab Spring and the Egyptian Revolution, and that's a lot of what this book is about. It's about, the two revolutions, the one in the 50s and then the one in the teens. This is a story where a son he's not only telling his mother's story, but he's like literally, or he says he's literally reliving her memories. Can you talk a little bit about how you came about that device, like how you decided to write it that way?
Well, it was very strange because when I committed to a long term fiction project in English, I I found I could. So the way this started, it was about the Arab Spring, and the mother, the main character, only really appeared in one chapter of the book. But then somebody pointed out that this was the best chapter, and I realized that if I told this woman's life story, I would be able to cover 70 years of Egyptian history, and so kind of really contextualize the events of 2011, which is what I set out to write about, and that's the way it happened. But anyhow, so I found myself able for the first time in my life to actually inhabit a female perspective, which I hadn't been able to do in Arabic, and it's nothing to do with the Arabic language or the English language. It was just I think when I changed the language of this kind of writing, but something gave, something like I was liberated somehow, and this happened. So, but I still didn't feel entirely confident in kind of writing the female perspective. So I had to come
Right.
up with, it was her son, who was speaking, and and part of the sort of the magical realism or the fantastical spirit of the book came through when I realized I could do that by making him experience these things as her, as opposed to just reporting on the experiences or retelling them. Because if you have a character speaking, it has to be like plausibility demands that if he's talking about something that didn't happen to him, he can't know everything, and I didn't want an omniscient narrator. I didn't want that kind of thing. So the way I solved that was to create the situation where he would go up into the attic and he would have these visions where he was his mother, and which seemed evocative in all kinds of ways and kind of appropriate to the idea that, I mean, the book is really about how mothers make people make men in Egypt, and how all these political and social failures are because are due to lack of recognition of that. So it's so it seemed appropriate to make
Yeah,
him.
it's something I think that it preserves is this idea of secrets and family secrets, because if she had told him everything, then you wouldn't get the sense that she had secrets, and some of the stuff that he sees she would never have told him, probably, right? So I think that allows us to see him experiencing, realizing who his mother really was without, it would seem less realistic for her to actually tell him all those things, I think, than for him to have these visions,
Well, I
maybe. I
mean,
don't know.
there is a bit where she kind of tells him, but she only tells him about things that are happening to her at the time
Right.
when she's over 70. And of course, I mean, I think some of what he sees she will have forgotten. I mean, parts of the book, like some episodes are explicitly like that. You know, she's actually blocked them out and she's forgotten about them. She doesn't know they, like her friend Lena, for example.
Yeah.
She's completely forgotten about her until the end of her life, until the end of her own life. But also, even if she remembered, I mean, a lot of this is very scandalous to her. Is very. I mean, she wouldn't dream of telling her son about these things, and that I think has to do with her transformations. So the book is really about how she changes, how she became something she wasn't, and then the revolution brought that other person back somehow, but also, you know, ended up totally alienating her. Like, I don't want to give away the
Yeah,
the
don't
ending,
give
but
away too much.
yeah.
She's a really memorable character. She's really going to stick with me. And I think one of the reasons is how much she does change and how much she experiences. She's almost like an amalgamation of a lot of different women. And one of the things that I like about her character is that, you know, I think in those of us who live in the West, the like image of Arab women that is projected back to us is very static. But the women that I know, like I know women who didn't wear hijab and then wore hijab, or who wore hijab and then didn't wear hijab, who's became more conservative or became more liberal. Just like any person can change in their life. And so she's just like, there's so much change in her life. It's a really, she's a really rich character. So tell me about how you created, because you said that she just appeared in one chapter and then she became like the center of the book. How did you think about this character and like sort of who inspired her? What does she represent in the book for you?
Well, I mean, the way it started out, like in that chapter of the original project, which you know was abandoned. She was like the details, the biographical details were based on my mother's biography. So my mother was a huge inspiration for that character. But as things progressed and as I kind of made up this life that she lived, especially the more kind of scandalous details, I realized I was really writing about myself as though I was my mother. So had I been my mother, this is what it would have been like. So it's a bit complicated in that way. I mean, I don't think she's my mother for all kinds of reasons, but I mean, she started out. I mean, the like the outline of her life is similar to my mother, to my mother's to the outline of my mother's life. I don't know if I consciously thought of particular women in other than my mother, but I think I was always thinking in terms of like the history of Egypt and the culture of Egypt, the unspoken, the unofficial history and the culture, and the way that I mean, Egypt is the motherland. One of the epithets of Egypt is like mother of the world. Al Dunya, and so there's this constant sort of and people are crazy about motherhood in Egypt. I mean, truly insane about the whole motherhood thing, and and I'm an only child, you know, and I was bonded to my mother for a very long time. I didn't actually, I mean, I started kind of trying to break away in my late teens, but I realize now I didn't fully break away until I was 35 or something ridiculous, you know. So there's this. It's a very powerful, it's a very heavy, powerful thing, motherhood, and I was trying to bring that to bear on the history of Egypt as well. So she's like, it says that in the book, she's like a fractal of Egypt, like this woman, Amna. So yeah, so I was thinking in terms of like social and cultural tropes more than individual people as such. But I guess, I mean, I remembered, sorry if I'm rambling, but I remembered that another thing that inspired me was an aunt of mine,
Okay.
who, before she died, had stopped praying. I mean, she was extremely conservative and very religious and everything. And then she was ill for not a very long time, for maybe a month or so. And during her illness, her final illness, she could not persuaded. She could not be persuaded to perform salah or do anything, and she would just, and that was fresh in my mind as well. But I kind of completely forgot about that after the book. So there must be all kinds of things like that,
Well, it's interesting that you say that, you realized that you were kind of writing about yourself when, Nour, he's the narrator, says that he's become his mother almost in telling her stories. There's a book. I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you about it. I've forgotten the full name of it. It's like Brighton something, but this is about a guy who is Jewish Egyptian living in New York now, and he literally time travels back to Alexandria as his grandmother. And so I was thinking about that in this book, where there's this like blending of, the son and the mother, and the blending of the generations. Something that I really admired about the book was the way that Amna is victimized in so many ways. There are some really, really quite like traumatic scenes that I'm not going to give away, but she never seemed to me like a victim. Like she always in some way fights back, and I admired how you had this way of balancing sort of pathos and comedy, and sort of using farce to sort of diffuse some of these situations, but at the same time, I never felt like you were underplaying the difficulty of these scenes or fetishizing her victimization at all. So can you talk a little bit about how you approach some of those scenes? I'm thinking about, a couple of scenes in particular, how you approached writing them.
Well, I mean, there's kind of two levels to this. The actual, like the technical aspects of the writing, I think you're totally right that, you would kind of soften it in various ways, including humor. And I think using humor to kind of deal with difficult realities is a very Egyptian thing anyway.
Right.
I mean, I didn't kind of come up with that, but also I think just, I mean, the making the language a little more lyrical, or kind of making it sing a little in those scenes, so that people have something to make it okay,
Yeah.
to make what's happening okay. And that's the writing level, but there's also the thinking level, which I think, I mean, one of my issues with contemporary social justice discourse is how agency is always taken away from the victims. When you talk about someone being victimized, whether for whether because of an immutable characteristic or because of a situation in life, you always kind of you assume that they have absolutely no agency, and I really resent that, and it's also something that I saw in my own mother in real life, that. I mean, she's not somebody who would describe herself as a feminist or an activist or anything like that. But I would see people, like much younger people, who did describe themselves as feminists and sort of went on podiums and I could see the huge contrast in them sort of playing up these things to almost like careerism. Whereas my mother would never even, it wouldn't occur to her to talk about these things, right? But she dealt with them in a very effective way. I mean, as effective as she could, So I wanted to honor that. I wanted to honor the agency of the victim, especially the Egyptian woman victim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember one time, like when I was in Saudi, and of course people always think Saudi women are just victims for their society, being at like an Eid prayer, and this was a long time ago, but like the imam was like preaching that women shouldn't come to Eid prayer, and these two women next to me were like, "You can't stop us," like. So she reminded me of women that I knew, and and also it complicates the story of these types of societal sort of practices that victimized women. Is that, you know, it wasn't just that you show family members sort of being part of her victimization, and then you show her fighting back against them at the same time. So it's this sort of complicated picture.
But of course, I mean, the big secret about the Arab patriarchy is that it's actually a matriarchy. I mean, there are, I mean, all of these phenomena do happen and people are victimized in that way and it's horrible and everything, but really they also wield enormous amounts of power, like unimaginable amounts of power. And it's almost, in some cases, it's almost like for, like, in compensation for what happens to them. Like we're women and we're going to be victimized, but because of that, we're going to have enormous power, even over the men, you know, not just over the children, or sometimes also over the men.
What's an example of that in the character Mouna's life, like her power?
I think she completely takes over the household and her husband's life. You know, she almost like forces him to get a different job and to live in a certain way. And that kind of happened to my father with my mother. I mean, not in as dramatic a way, but definitely. I mean, I think he would have led a completely different life, left to his own devices. You know. But the kind of the bourgeois aspects of our household and certain kinds of priorities and certain kinds of choices, I mean, she completely kind of imposed. And to this day, I mean, he died in 2000. To this day, she kind of makes fun of him for refusing certain things, and she I mean, not bitterly, but she does complain about the resistance that she encountered in making certain decisions on his part, and it's as if his opinion doesn't really count in any way, you know, and I think that's fairly typical. I mean, I don't know if you'd agree. I think that's you know, I mean, when we think of the patriarchy and you know, conservative societies, we think of these tyrannical men, you know, despotic men.
But that's not.
But that's not the way it works. No.
Yeah, no, I can think of a bunch of tyrannical women that I know. Yeah, well, so there's another, you know, woman in the story who is sort of off. She's very central to the story, but she's off scene, and that's Shimo, the sister, and Amna's daughter, and you know. So the conceit of the book is that Nour is writing these letters to his sister, and it's kind of like right after their mother dies, right? And so I found myself in certain times like imagining her reaction to some of the things he was writing to her, like in a sisterly, brotherly kind of way. Can you talk about that character a little bit? And because I read something where you said that she was less central at first and became more important to the story.
Well, I think, I mean,
proving your point about the patriarchy being a matriarchy, right? The women characters just came right in.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, she was just a device in a sense. I mean, the epistolary aspect of the book was not as pronounced at first in the first version of it.
Okay.
But he had to be talking to somebody, and to somebody whose main language was English, because the book was in English, right? So I came up with this sister. But as the story developed, as the book developed, I thought there was a strange kind of poetic justice, a very beautiful thing that happened in real life. She's the only thing in the book that's American, right? She's the only thing in the book that exists in America, and as the book got closer to publication in America, her role kind of expanded, you know, gradually. And but also, of course, I realized in that process, I realized that she was a kind of wasted opportunity, because I'm talking about women dissenters, and she is. I always imagined her that way. Like what ended up getting written was there at the back of my mind. It wasn't like I didn't necessarily make anything up that hadn't been that hadn't existed in the first draft. I knew about her, but we still don't hear from her, because I think that would be a completely different book. And I feel I took enough of a risk writing about the mother.
Right.
One woman is enough for me.
I mean, if I imagine if there were parts of the book from her perspective, yeah, it would be a completely different book. I think there is something powerful about just like imagining what her responses would be, and imagining her, like we are kind of her. We're reading, and if we're in America, we're reading it from the position that she was in. And then when you get to the end of the book, it kind of hit me in a different way. Like, there are some things that are revealed at the end of the book, where I'm like, oh, like Shimo would be learning this for the first time. And her brother has a very tortured way of telling her these things. Like, it's taken out. This is a really long letter. So I think, I mean, yeah, I think that was a really interesting and good choice. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the novel, because we've talked about how it sort of goes between kind of the 1950s and kind of going up this way, and then also 2011. And I was thinking a lot while reading the book about Midnight's Children, a book by Salman Rushdie, where it's like a moment in history, which is the partition and independence of India, is this like fulcrum of the book, right? But your book, it's like there's sort of like a double helix thing going on or something. So talk a little bit about that structure and why you chose it and how it helped you to talk about history.
Well, at first, so as I was saying, I started out wanting to write a novel about the Arab Spring, about the January Revolution, which happened in 2011, right? But I also realized that to do that properly, to do that in a way that would be satisfactory to me, I had to contextualize this in the story of modern Egypt or contemporary Egypt, which obviously starts in it really starts in 56. I mean, the official date is 52 because that's when the coup that became a revolution happened. But it really started with the nationalization of the Suez Canal. That's when Gamal Abdel Nasser became like this hero, and that's and it was already a republic, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so the main thing that kind of changed as I worked on the final edit was turning them into shorter alternate chapters. So it started out being chunks. Like he would have a vision of a time in 56 or 64 or something, and that would be presented as one big chapter, and then things would happen in the present, which is 2011 to 2015, and that would be a separate chapter. And then my editor suggested that I kind of interweave, and I was very reluctant at first. I didn't think it would work, but I said I will try. I will see how it works. And once I started doing that, I was really, really impressed. I thought I thought it was brilliant. They kind of, because they started talking to each other in a different way, right? And yeah, so that's but the double fulcrum was there from the beginning. Obviously, like I wanted to talk about 2011, and I realized that you couldn't really talk about that without talking about 1956. To understand, like the place of the military, for example. I mean, even the way that the events were being dealt with in the West, and judgments were being made. So you talk about a coup, or you talk about military rule, but it was a military state. I mean, it had been a military state for 70 years. It's just so yeah. And I hope I did a good job of kind of presenting the Arab Spring in that way, because. Also, another thing that kind of changed in the editing was the amount of political detail.
Okay.
And I could totally understand people being alienated by that
Did you add it for readers to understand?
I took it away.
Oh, you took it away.
There was a lot more political
okay.
detail, and my editors were just were a little freaked out by it because it was so unfamiliar, and the more detailed you get in any country's politics, I think the less comprehensible it becomes in a different country. So I'm kind of really happy with the final balance of that.
Why in the beginning did you have so much of the political stuff? Did that seem important to you in terms of?
Well, it just kind of came, you know.
Right.
I mean, I didn't really think about it. I initially thought it was a reasonable amount.
Yeah.
but it was, as it turned out, I think it was too much. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think right now, the way the book is now, there's so much history in it, but it also makes you think about like living. I mean, I feel right like this week, like we're really living through history, guys. Like, and in the book, you see all these moments where I think Mouna doesn't really realize what she's living through, but her son, looking back, knowing everything that's happened and having been involved in the 2011 revolution, can see all of it through her eyes in a different way. And I felt like that is really relevant right now for American readers as we're watching our history spiral and double helix right now. We often, I mean, a lot of writers in the US don't really, we don't really focus on history a lot, and we don't really focus on those moments except for 9/11. That is the one moment of history that I think that a lot of times we focus on as sort of a fulcrum. But I could see right now that we should be thinking that way, the way that you're thinking about Egyptian history in the book. This is your first novel in English. I think we're going to ask you one more question, and then do you want to go to Q&A or
Sure,
keep chatting?
Yeah.
Okay. This is your first novel in English, and I was just wondering about whether that changed anything in your process, the way you thought about audience or craft or literary influences, or was it all the same as when you've written your previous books?
It was pretty much all the same until the final stage that involved an editor, and then it was a lot more thinking about the reader. Like in Arabic literature, partly because society is not as kind of profit oriented, you don't really think about the reader at all. Like you just do your thing and hope for the best, Whereas here, there's a lot of focus on how readable this is, whether it makes sense, whether it's approachable, et cetera, which, and I was really grateful for that. I didn't really have any complaints in this department, because in some ways I had been missing it, with like my first Arabic novel, which is a big, complicated thing. I think it would have benefited from that kind of editing,
Yeah.
which wasn't available. So
Yeah.
Other than that, I don't think there was it was kind of anticlimactic in a way, because I thought it would be different, but it wasn't really. I mean, one main difference is when you write in Arabic, which as a rule is in standard Arabic, then you kind of negotiate how to include the vernacular, which is a separate dialect, almost like a different language. And in English, I had a kind of equivalent to that, which is how to bring Arabic into any kind of Arabic into.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I that's something that I think about a lot when I'm writing my books, is how to, if the characters are speaking Arabic, I often will like write the stuff in my head in Arabic, and then I translate it into English. But what's your process for doing that?
It wasn't like that. It was more like thinking about an equivalence in English, in my kind of English, which is very kind of polyglot, I guess. It doesn't really have a particular geographic origin or identity, but then I would include words or even sometimes expressions that I felt were untranslatable, and I thought that worked in the sense of, like, even if people don't understand them literally, they get a sense from the context and from the sound of it that this is different. And I think that's really how we experience the world, right? If you can speak both and you hear something in Arabic, it's never, like, some things are untranslatable, right? You couldn't translate them, but you can kind of sense an equivalence in a certain kind of way. And if you keep tokens of the original of the language that you're trying to convey. I think that really helps with this sense of equivalence. So I would claim that this is like Egyptian Egyptian English, whatever that
Egyptian
means.
English, yeah.
You know, which doesn't really
Egyptlish.
exist, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't. It's not. I mean, it would be different in a different book, I guess. But so it was. I mean, not everything can be very rationally justified, but it was a sense. It was having a sense of where things worked, and definitely not kind of translating literally. That's very important, you know. But thinking about how things resonate. And sometimes I would translate literally, knowing that it had a completely different effect on. So toil of my tummy, for example.
Right.
When a woman calls her son toil of my tummy, I mean that's completely unremarkable.
How do you say that in Egyptian?
Danoya. Danoya. Dano. Yeah. So I mean it's just it's in Arabic it doesn't really it's so widespread and so received that it doesn't really use, but in English it becomes this very poetic, this
Right.
it's very unusual expression. So there was that as well, you know, there was kind of playing on the differences at that level as well.
Yeah. Sometimes like I sort of want to push back up against this idea that Arabic is a more like flowery language, but in some ways it is. Like there are like so many, like I think the character struggles with like knowing the right like thing you're supposed to say, like in response to people at the funeral and things. And I'm always like, what am I supposed to say to that? There's this thing that people always say, you know. Like, you know, I told you Mabruk earlier, you say Allah Yubarak Fik, you like that kind of thing. And I noticed something else in the book. I noticed a lot of wordplay that I think that in a lot of like American writers, we've stripped back a lot of language, you know, and I enjoyed the wordplay, and I didn't know if it was like, you know, a sort of something from your Arabic background, or if it was just there because you liked playing with the English words, you know, like, and it's fine either way. I don't, you know, yeah.
I mean, I just want to say that like when I wrote this book, because it was my first kind of serious effort in the English language, I wasn't really aware of. I mean, I was completely unaware of the zeitgeist of what was being written here, what was regarded well. So I think that gave me a certain kind of freedom to do what I wanted to do,
Right.
in a way that maybe I don't have now.
Right.
Like now that I've read as much as I've read of like newer things, and that I've dealt with the editor, et cetera, I kind of know what is expected more.
Yeah.
And so maybe I will automatically kind of cut back. But yeah, I do like wordplay in both languages. And in English, alliteration is like a wonderful thing that doesn't really exist in Arabic.
Yeah. Of the books that you've read recently from the zeitgeist, what are some that you've enjoyed?
Oh, I don't really want to name names.
Okay, that's fine.
But they're let me just say they're mostly by African and Asian writers working in English. Yeah. So I mean, I guess that makes sense because like it's a sensibility and a background that's similar,
right?
You know, whereas like the Brooklynite novel is not particularly, you know, it's not particularly relevant to me or the kind of lives that I'm writing about.
Right.
There was something this short story writer from Kashmir said in a podcast recently about not being able to enter what's being written in America. And he kind of, and that was partly his way of justifying struggling with getting things published as well.
Yes.
And I think that really resonated with me because, you know, I mean, I don't think I'm talking about a different world. Like he said, he was talking about a different world. I don't think I'm talking about a different world, but I think I'm talking from a position that is so far away from the position of most people in the literary world here,
right?
That it sometimes becomes hard to establish communication, you know.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I think that a lot of times when you're trying to break into publishing, the people who are the gatekeepers, they haven't experienced that that you're talking about. Do you want to invite some questions, or
Sure.
do you have something else you want to talk about before we do that?
I'm fine.
Okay. Do we have any questions? Yes. There's a microphone right up here if you want. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming all the way to America. Welcome. I have a question. I find the idea of you writing in English fascinating. Was there a moment where you asked yourself, in which language should I give birth to this story, right? And was there something you gained or you lost by doing it? Is Arabic the language you speak to yourself in? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I've always had. I mean, this is not a case of me kind of completely switching to a language I'm familiar with or had never worked in before. I mean, I've always written in both languages. I just hadn't done my own creative work or much of it in English. I hadn't written a novel in English. I'd written a few short stories, and I still cannot write poetry in English. I write poetry. I write a lot of poetry in Arabic, but never in English for some reason. So in part, it was a conscious decision because of the point I was at in my writing life to see what I could do. I mean, I always had the ambition to do a big novel about Egypt in English, and Eman posted this incredibly perceptive Instagram picture where she mentioned like 4 different books, and
I got them.
Yeah.
Want me to repeat it?
and it was amazing because they were really the books. They were really my influences, and we hadn't talked about this.
I read your essays, so some of them I I got from Beer in the Snooker Club because you mentioned in one of your essays.
So that's
amazing book.
Yeah,
Can we talk about that book for a second?
We could totally talk about that book.
I read that book a couple of years ago. It was written in the 60s, right?
Yeah, I think it was written in 59. It was published in 64.
Okay, because he died not that long after that, right?
He died in 68 or 69. He killed himself.
What's the name of the author?
Waghi.
Okay, and it's an Anglophone book, right? An English language book by an Egyptian writer. It's hilarious.
And tragic.
And tragic at the same time.
Yeah.
Which
is a very Egyptian thing, you know.
Right.
And the humor is in it is very Egyptian. I mean, the English is impeccable, and kind of British and upper class British.
And they make fun of each other for not having good Arabic.
Totally, yes. But the sensibility is so completely Egyptian, and it was. And I think writing about Egyptian history in a different language, in a European language specifically, is liberating in a very particular way because it's the language of the former colonizer, and it kind of almost like bypasses the nationalist discourse. So I mean, Arabic changed by nationalism. And when you write in Arabic, you have to, I mean, especially if it has to do with history, you have to kind of take account of that. You have to position yourself in the language itself vis-a-vis the nationalist discourse. I mean, often in ironic and sarcastic ways, you know.
Right.
But in English, you don't have to do that. You can kind of invent the world anew. So, but what I gained, I mean, I think you maybe arrived a little late. But what I was saying is what I was able to write from a female perspective for the first time in my life, which I hadn't been able to do, and not because of anything inherent to English or Arabic, just because I made that change. You know, I made that switch. And it happened. So yeah, but mainly it was an ambition of mine, and the one unrealized ambition that still exists is to do a whole novel in the vernacular, in like Egyptian Arabic.
Oh, okay.
Like a modern contemporary novel where the Egyptian Arabic doesn't figure as Egyptian Arabic, where it's just the language.
It's the language.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe that'll happen. I don't know.
I think that would be amazing. Yeah, that would be really amazing. Any other questions? Yes, please. Oh, could you use that?
Thank you and good evening. I was quite fascinated by the discussion about language and Arabic versus English. And you said it at the beginning and you just repeated it now by saying that you were able to write this in English and you probably couldn't have written the same way in Arabic because writing in English, not because of the English language, allowed you to basically inhabit a female character rather than a male one. So if it's not related to language, and what is it that allowed you using English to inhabit the female character? Thank you.
That's a really good question, but I don't really have a very clear answer to this myself. I mean, I think it's a fascinating phenomenon, right? But I think it probably has to do with self-awareness of a particular kind, where when I stopped using the language that I had used for so many male characters in a particular context, I was able to let go of my fears or inhibitions about becoming female, if you like, and I think it's something along those lines. I'm not really sure. It just kind of happened, and as I say, I wasn't entirely free of that. I was. At an earlier stage of my writing career, there was this own voice phenomenon, and it seemed to have like subliminally really affected me. Like I don't feel comfortable.
Women should write about women. And,
yeah, and if you're black, you can't have a white character. If you're, But I really, I'm totally against that in principle. But in practice, you do have inhibitions and you do have.
I mean,
issues,
if you're writing from a point of view that it's not one that you've had, you have to do more observation and research. But as a woman writer, I feel that especially in U.S. publishing, like an Arab woman writer is expected to write about Arab woman things, and I always want to write about men. And I feel that, I mean, we've seen it a lot over the past year or so that only you heard about this. The West doesn't give a shit about me. Is the name of one of your essays, and I think the West doesn't give a shit about Arab men, and they pretend to give a shit about Arab women, but they don't really. So I've always wanted to write, and also my world has men and women in it, and so I've always wanted to write both male and female characters, and not just write, a book about women. My book that's coming out next is more woman focused than my first book, but there are men in it, and I think that you're well. I actually wanted to ask you about some of the men in your book, because there are some hilariously awful men in this book, and what was it like to write some of these just really corrupt, terrible male characters?
That was just business as usual. That was just the order of the day. That's what I'd always done, more or less. I'm joking, obviously, but it wasn't. I mean, satire in this context isn't really difficult for me. It doesn't, especially if they're not main characters. Like if I was actually writing about one of those characters as the focus of the book, then it would be different, because I would have to go deeper. But I think as sort of supporting characters to this person's life, the one character that I kind of identified with and was paying homage to in a certain way was my father, who's kind of, again, I mean, it's not the same person. My father never went to prison, for example.
Right.
But similar to Amna's husband
in terms of his beliefs and
yes,
convictions,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was fun making fun of him. It was fun kind of caricaturing him in this way,
right?
It lovingly,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's one of the few male characters who's lovingly caricatured as opposed to skewered in the book. So, well, is there some aspect of the book that you want people to pay attention to that people tend to ignore?
I don't know if I can answer that, to be honest. There's an aspect of the book that I want people not to pay too much attention to, which is the politics. You know, it's I mean, the politics and the history is there because it's in these people's lives, and it's about it's about this woman and about these people, and through her about Egypt. You know, and hopefully, I mean, the whole point of a book like this in English is to kind of what's the word, invade, in, you know, go into the discourse in a surreptitious way and kind of change it, especially the discourse about that part of the world, as you were saying, uh, which is defined by indifference, by sometimes murderous indifference,
Right.
in the West. So hopefully making people aware of the existence of other parts of the world and other kinds of ways of being in the world. And I think that politics, when it's dealt with in a certain way, can totally obscure that in literature. So
Yeah.
so I would hope that doesn't get too much attention, but it hasn't so far. I mean, in what's been written about the book, it's really, it doesn't. I mean, I'm not sort of concerned about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really human story with the political is sort of the air they breathe and the water they swim in, right? Like it doesn't feel heavy-handed to me. It feels like this is what life is, you know.
I think the political in America. I mean, this is obviously my impression from afar. I think the political in America is something people do very consciously. It's something people go to and motivated by morals most of the time. Whereas in places like Egypt, the political is just something you have to deal with. It's not
Right.
It's not by choice. I mean, most people, most even politicized people, would keep away from it if they could. You know, so I think that's an interesting difference. And
I think some American writers would argue that certain types of writers in America have to be or expected to be more politicized than others, and that, you know, especially a lot of white writers can just like say they're very political, but of course anything we write is political in a way. So
but I think it's more intentional, and
yeah.
like politics as a phenomenon in life. I mean, not necessarily even in how you write about it, but
Right.
but I think people go to it more in the West than in America, whereas in the Arab world it kind of comes
It
to
comes
them.
to you. Okay. Yeah.
But actually, I disagree with this. We couldn't separate politics with the private human lives, with the Egyptians, or I'm speaking on the Egyptians as I'm an Egyptian myself. We couldn't separate it. The way we are talking with, the way we are loving, the way we are living, it's all about politics.
I think that's what he's saying. That's what you're saying.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
yes.
So it's very much different than here in the States.
Yeah.
We do have like an indirect way of expressing things through humor, through says or whatever.
Yeah.
It's all about
Although sometimes in the Arab world, and it's usually funny when people do that, but sometimes they say, you know, culture has nothing to do with politics. when it suits them, you know, when they get a prize from the wrong donor or whatever, and they'll be like, no, this is culture. This has nothing to do with it. You know.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Youssef.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you want to say?
No, I just want to thank everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everyone.